December 11th, 1941. 0600 hours. Flagship Yubari, approaching Wake Atoll. Commander Tachibana Masaru, intelligence officer to Rear Admiral Kajioka Sadamichi, reviewed the final reconnaissance photographs in the cramped chart room. The images showed 3 small islands forming a wishbone around a lagoon, barely 2.5 miles across at their widest point. He counted the visible structures, defensive positions, fuel tanks. His pen moved across the page, tallying numbers that confirmed what Tokyo had promised. This would be over by nightfall. A few hundred Marines, perhaps a dozen aircraft, some coastal guns. Against his admiral's force of 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 troop transports, and 450 Special Naval Landing Force troops, resistance would be token at best. They cannot hold, Tachibana wrote in his log. The mathematics are certain. What Tachibana didn't know was that he was about to witness the only failed assault in the entire first wave of Japan's Pacific offensive. The mathematics were staggering, but not in the way anyone expected. Wake Island measured approximately 2.5 square miles of coral and scrub. The entire garrison numbered 449 Marines, 68 Navy personnel, and approximately 1,000 civilian construction workers, most unarmed. Against this, Japan would commit, over the course of 12 days, more than 24 warships, including 2 fleet carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, multiple light cruisers and destroyers, and thousands of troops. The final casualty ratio would reveal something impossible. The Americans would lose 120 military personnel. Japan would lose over 800 killed, 2 destroyers sunk, multiple ships damaged, and dozens of aircraft destroyed. The defender-to-attacker loss ratio would be roughly 1-7, an inversion of every military principle that suggested attackers should expect to lose more than defenders only when assaulting prepared fortifications with overwhelming defensive advantages. But the real mathematics lay elsewhere. Wake possessed 12 Grumman Wildcat fighters, 8 serviceable after the first Japanese air raid. It possessed 12 5-inch coastal defense guns. Against these, Japan initially sent approximately 60 aircraft, 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 patrol boats, and 2 troop transports. This should have been sufficient. The standard calculation suggested that a 3-to-1 superiority in forces guaranteed offensive success. Japan enjoyed better than 10-to-1 superiority in ships, 5-to-1 in aircraft, and their troops were among the best trained in the Imperial Navy. Yet on December 11th, they would withdraw in defeat, having lost 2 destroyers and hundreds of men without landing a single soldier on Wake's beaches. The story begins not on December 11th, but 3 weeks earlier, when Wake Island was merely a refueling stop on Penas, American Airways Trans-Pacific Clipper route. The atoll had been American territory since 1889, but only in 1934 did the Navy begin seriously developing it as a forward base. By December 1941, construction was incomplete. The 12 Wildcats of Marine Fighter Squadron 211 had arrived only 4 days before Pearl Harbor. Major James Devereaux, commanding the 1st Marine Defense Battalion, had 523 men under his command, though nearly 100 were technically Navy personnel. He possessed no radar, no torpedo boats, inadequate anti-aircraft weapons, insufficient ammunition, and no illusions about what would happen when Japan came. Devereaux was 39 years old, a veteran of China and Nicaragua, a careful man who understood logistics and limitations. He had spent November preparing defensive positions, registering his coastal guns on pre-plotted firing points, dispersing his forces, and preparing for what everyone knew was coming. When word reached Wake about Pearl Harbor on December 8th, local time, his first order was to scatter the Wildcats to revetments around the airfield. Major Paul Putnam, commanding the fighter squadron, protested that dispersal would make maintenance difficult. Devereaux insisted. That decision would prove crucial. The Japanese viewed Wake as they viewed Guam, as they viewed all the isolated American positions scattered across the Pacific. Obstacles to be swept aside en route to more important objectives. Wake sat astride the direct route between the Marshall Islands and Hawaii. With Guam already fallen on December 10th, Wake became a necessary acquisition. A forward base for Japanese operations, a denial of American logistics. The operation was assigned to the South Seas Force under Vice Admiral Inoue Shigeyoshi, who delegated the actual assault to Rear Admiral Kajioka Sadamichi. Kajioka was 51 years old, a graduate of the Naval Academy at Etajima, an experienced commander who had led destroyers in the previous war. For Wake, he assembled the 4th Fleet Striking Force. The light cruisers Yubari, Tatsuda, and Tenryu, the destroyers Yayoi, Mutsuki, Kisaragi, Hayate, Oite, and Asanagi, 2 older destroyers converted to patrol boats, and 2 medium transports carrying the Special Naval Landing Force troops. Intelligence reports indicated perhaps 500 defenders, a dozen aircraft, some coastal guns. No one in Kajioka's command considered the operation particularly dangerous. After the stunning success at Pearl Harbor, after the easy conquests in Malaya and the Philippines, Wake seemed almost an afterthought. Commander Tachibana had prepared the intelligence estimates. He knew that Wake's garrison had been reinforced in October, that Marine defense battalions were well trained, that American coastal artillery could be effective if properly handled. But numbers were numbers. His charts showed that even if every Marine was an expert marksman, even if every coastal gun achieved perfect accuracy, the mathematics favored the attackers by overwhelming margins. 3 cruisers could pour hundreds of shells per minute onto an island 2 miles across. 6 destroyers could saturate the shoreline with fire. 450 assault troops, once landed, could overwhelm defenders already suppressed by bombardment. Tachibana calculated that resistance might last 6 hours, perhaps 12 if the Marines proved stubborn. By nightfall on December 11th, the rising sun flag would fly over Wake. The first revelation came not at dawn, but at 0630. When Japanese bombers from Roy in the Marshall Islands struck Wake's airfield. They came in at medium altitude, 34 twin-engine bombers in perfect formation, and found the Wildcats dispersed in revetments rather than clustered in neat rows. 7 of the 12 fighters were destroyed on the ground, but 5 survived, and those 5 would prove more dangerous than anyone imagined. At 0300 hours on December 11th, Kajioka's force approached Wake from the south. The plan was straightforward. Bombard the island from offshore, land troops on the southern beaches, overwhelm the defenders. As dawn broke, the Japanese ships opened fire from approximately 7,000 yards, beyond the range they believed the coastal guns could effectively respond. This was the first miscalculation. Major Devereaux had registered his 5-inch guns at every likely firing point around the island. Battery L, commanded by First Lieutenant Clarence Barninger, covered the southern approaches. At 0515, as Japanese shells began falling on Wake, Barninger held his fire. The Japanese ships closed to 6,000 yards. Still, Barninger waited. At 5,000 yards, the destroyer Hayate swung to port to begin a high-speed run toward the beach. Barninger's guns remained silent. At 0610, with Hayate closing to 4,700 yards, Barninger gave the order to fire. The first salvo straddled Hayate. The second salvo struck her amidships. The third hit her magazine. Lieutenant Barninger would later testify. She went up in a tower of flame and smoke. I could see debris flying, pieces of the ship, I think bodies, I couldn't be sure. She disappeared in the explosion. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing but debris and oil on the water. The entire destroyer, gone. I had been trained that coastal guns could damage ships, could drive them off. I had never imagined we could simply delete a destroyer from existence in 3 salvos. Aboard Yubari, Commander Tachibana felt the concussion of Hayate's destruction 6,000 yards away. He rushed to the bridge and raised his binoculars. Where Hayat should have been, he saw only a spreading oil slick and scattered wreckage. His first thought was mine, perhaps a submarine. But the flash pattern was wrong. Those were large caliber gun hits. His second thought was impossible. Coastal guns did not sink destroyers with a few shots. Coastal guns suppressed fire, damaged ships, forced them to keep distance. They did not achieve magazine detonations. The battle had been underway less than 1 hour, and already the mathematical certainty was crumbling. At 0630, the remaining 5 Wildcats from VMF 211 rose from Wake's damaged airfield. Captain Henry Elrod led them south toward the Japanese ships. The pilots were young, most had never seen combat, but they had trained in dive bombing techniques that fighter pilots typically ignored. Against ships, such attacks were considered marginally effective at best. Fighters lacked the bomb load of proper dive bombers, lacked the armor, lacked the training. Elrod's division hit the light cruiser Yubari with 250-pound bombs. The cruiser staggered but maintained formation. They hit the destroyer Yayoi, starting fires. They strafed troop transports, killing men crowded on deck. And then Elrod saw the destroyer Kisaragi, which had moved close to shore to support the landing. He dove through anti-aircraft fire, released his bomb, and pulled up. The bomb hit Kisaragi's depth charges. The destroyer erupted. Not the magazine explosion that had destroyed Hayate, but a slower, more complete disintegration as the depth charges detonated in sequence, tearing the ship apart from stern to bow. She sank in less than 5 minutes. Of her crew of 167, only 4 men survived. Commander Tachibana watched from Yubari's bridge as Japan lost its second destroyer in 30 minutes. He calculated quickly. 2 destroyers sunk represented 400 men lost, represented 20% of Kajioka's striking force destroyed, represented damage to the Admiral's flagship and 2 other ships. Against this, the Americans had lost, perhaps 7 aircraft on the ground? A few men to the bombardment? At 0700 hours, Admiral Kajioka gave the order to withdraw. The Special Naval Landing Force troops, who had been preparing to board their landing craft, stood down. The transports reversed course. The surviving destroyers laid smoke and retreated north. By 0800 hours, the entire Japanese force was withdrawing toward Roy in the Marshall Islands, leaving behind the oil slicks marking Hayate and Kisaragi's graves, leaving behind the first Japanese defeat of the Pacific War. Tachibana wrote in his log, "We approached with overwhelming force and were repulsed with heavy losses. The American fire was accurate and determined. Our intelligence estimates were inadequate. The coastal guns are more numerous and better handled than reported. The aircraft, though few, are more dangerous than expected. We must revise all assumptions about American defensive capabilities." That evening, in Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters received Kajioka's report. The shock was profound. In 3 days of war, Japan had achieved victory after victory. Pearl Harbor, British Malaya, the Philippines, Guam. All had fallen, or were falling according to schedule. Only Wake had driven off the assault force. The question became, What made Wake different? The answer lay in details that no one had properly weighted. Major Devereaux's 1st Marine Defense Battalion was trained specifically in coastal defense. They had practiced on these guns for months. Every gun commander knew his firing tables, his terrain, his registered points. When Lieutenant Barninger fired at Hayate, he was not making a desperation shot into the dark. He was firing at a target he had pre-plotted, at a range he had calculated, with a gun crew that had drilled the exact sequence of loading and firing hundreds of times. The Wildcats of VMF 211 were similarly prepared. Captain Elrod had trained his pilots in bombing attacks against ships, an unusual skill for fighter pilots. When they hit Kisaragi, they were executing a tactic they had practiced, not improvising under fire. Major Putnam, the squadron commander, would later testify, "We knew we couldn't win. Everyone knew that. But we also knew that if we were going to die, we might as well make them pay the highest price possible. So we trained for every contingency. Bombing ships, strafing landing craft, air-to-air combat, everything. When the war came, we were ready for that first day. We were never ready for all the days after." The mathematics were revealing themselves, but slowly, through details that accumulated into pattern. Wake's defenders numbered 449 Marines. Of these, approximately 300 were in the Defense Battalion, the rest in the aviation ground crews and supporting units. Against Kajioka's initial assault, perhaps 150 Marines were in position to fire. The coastal gun crews, the anti-aircraft crews, the beach defense positions. 150 men had driven off a fleet, but this was survivorship bias in reverse. The question was not how 150 men defeated a fleet. The question was how a fleet expected to defeat 150 prepared defenders on terrain they knew intimately, with weapons they had mastered, against an enemy who had to cross open water to reach them. Major Devereaux understood this immediately. When the Japanese withdrew, he gathered his officers. "They'll be back," he said, "and next time they'll bring more, much more." He was right, but even he could not imagine how much more. In Roy, Admiral Kajioka assembled his staff to plan the next assault. Commander Tachibana presented revised intelligence estimates. "The Americans have perhaps 20 coastal guns," he reported, upgrading from the original estimate of 12. "They may have as many as 8 to 10 operational aircraft. Their gun crews are highly trained. Their ammunition supply is adequate for extended defense. Their morale is high after repulsing our assault." Kajioka made his decision. "We cannot take Wake with current forces. Request reinforcement from combined fleet." The request went to Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, commander of the combined fleet, who was coordinating the return of the carrier strike force from Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto authorized the detachment of Carrier Division 2, the carriers Hiryu and Soryu, with their escorting cruisers and destroyers, to support Kajioka's second assault. Additionally, he ordered cruisers from other formations to join the attack. For Wake, Japan would commit 2 fleet carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, multiple light cruisers, 8 destroyers, and land-based air support from the Marshalls, to retake an atoll 2.5 miles across. Captain Abe Hiroaki, commander of Soryu, received his orders on December 16th while returning from Pearl Harbor. He later testified, "I was surprised by the assignment. We had just struck the American battle line at Pearl Harbor. Now we were being diverted to support an assault on a minor atoll. I understood the strategic necessity. Wake could not be allowed to remain in American hands." But the fact that 2 fleet carriers were required for what should have been a simple landing operation indicated that something had gone very wrong with the initial assault. When I learned the details, that we had lost 2 destroyers to coastal guns and a few fighters, I realized we had underestimated not just Wake's defenses, but the entire character of American resistance. From December 11th to December 23rd, Wake Island became a laboratory for testing assumptions about Pacific warfare. The Japanese bombed daily, sometimes twice daily. The remaining wildcats rose to meet them when they could. One by one, the fighters were lost. Captain Elrod, who had bombed Kisaragi, shot down 2 Japanese bombers on December 12th. On December 23rd, with no aircraft left, he fought as a ground defender and was killed leading a counterattack against Japanese landing forces. The daily bombing revealed the second layer of mathematical impossibility. Wake had no radar, no early warning except visual observation. Yet the wildcats consistently intercepted the raids. They did this by using coast watchers posted around the atoll who would telephone the airfield the moment they spotted approaching aircraft. In the crystalline Pacific air, visibility extended 40 to 50 miles. This gave the wildcats approximately 15 to 20 minutes warning, just enough time to take off, gain altitude, and intercept. The system was primitive, but effective. Technical Sergeant William Hamilton, one of the coast watchers, later recorded, "Every morning I would climb to my observation post on Peel Island and scan the horizon. When I saw them coming, always from the south, I'd call the airfield. Bandits approaching, bearing 180, number 30 plus. Then I'd watch our fighters take off, 5 fighters against 30 to 40 bombers and their escorts. They'd go up, and some of them wouldn't come back. Every day, fewer came back. By December 20th, we were down to 2. By December 23rd, none. I kept watching the horizon, but there was nothing left to call in." The civilian workers on Wake, originally brought to build facilities for Pan American Airways and the Navy, had refused evacuation when war came. Nearly all of them volunteered for combat roles. They manned anti-aircraft guns, served as stretcher bearers, carried ammunition, dug fortifications. When the final assault came, many fought alongside the Marines. Of the roughly 1,000 civilians, 49 were killed in action, 70 wounded. Their presence changed the mathematics in ways that Japanese intelligence had not anticipated. The garrison of 449 military personnel was actually a fighting force of nearly 1,500, 2/3 of them willing to fight. Foreman Dan Teeters, a civilian crane operator, later testified, "We knew we weren't soldiers, but this was our island. We'd built these facilities. We knew every inch of the place. When the Japs came, most of us figured we'd be killed anyway if we surrendered. Might as well make ourselves useful. I served on an anti-aircraft gun crew. Never fired a gun in my life before that. By the second week, I could load and fire faster than some of the Marines. Not because I was better, but because I had nothing else to do but practice. And I knew that when they came back, I'd need every bit of skill I could learn." The Japanese returned on December 23rd. This time, the Armada was overwhelming. 2 fleet carriers launched airstrikes that saturated Wake's defenses. The remaining coastal guns fired until they ran out of ammunition or were knocked out by bombs. Japanese destroyers closed to point-blank range and pumped shells into Marine positions. At 0230 hours on December 23rd, the first wave of Special Naval Landing Force troops hit the beaches. Major Devereaux's Marines fought them in the darkness, hand-to-hand in some positions. By dawn, Japanese troops controlled the airfield. By 0900 hours, they had pushed inland and threatened to split the Marine defenses. At 0730, Major Devereaux, after consulting with Commander Winfield Cunningham, the island's overall commander, sent the message that stunned the Pacific. "Enemy on island. Issue in doubt." Issue in doubt. The phrase would become legendary, suggesting that even surrounded and outnumbered, the defenders believed they could still win. The reality was more complex. Devereaux later explained, "I meant exactly what I said. The enemy was on the island. The issue was in doubt. We didn't know if we could throw them back into the sea or if they would overrun us. For several hours that morning, it genuinely could have gone either way. We had defenders in position, we had ammunition, we had prepared fallback positions. But they kept coming, and they had carrier air support that could hit any concentration of our forces. By mid-morning, I knew we couldn't win. But I wanted our people to know we had fought them to a standstill before the inevitable end." At 0752 hours on December 23rd, Commander Cunningham ordered surrender. The Marines were to cease firing and display white flags. Major Devereaux received the order at 0800 hours. He later testified, "It was the hardest order I ever gave. My men had fought for 12 days. They had repulsed one assault. They had inflicted more casualties than they suffered. They were still willing to fight. But I could see the mathematics. We were surrounded. We had no air support. We were almost out of ammunition. Continuing meant death for everyone, military and civilian. I gave the order to surrender, and every man who heard it looked at me as if I had betrayed them." The final accounting revealed the full scope of the impossibility. In 12 days of combat, the American forces on Wake lost 120 military personnel killed, 49 civilians killed. They destroyed 2 destroyers, 1 submarine, approximately 24 aircraft. They damaged multiple other ships, including carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. They delayed the Japanese advance by 12 days. Against this, Japan committed forces that grew from 12 ships and 450 troops to more than 30 ships, including 2 fleet carriers, thousands of troops, hundreds of aircraft, and sustained operations over 12 days. Japanese casualties exceeded 800 killed, more than 6 times American losses. The resource expenditure was staggering. 2 destroyers sunk, multiple ships damaged requiring repair, dozens of aircraft lost, thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition expended, the delay of carrier forces that were needed elsewhere. Commander Tachibana compiled the final report for Admiral Kajioka. He wrote, "Wake Island cost us more than any engagement since the war began. The Americans defended with extraordinary skill and determination. Our initial intelligence estimates underestimated the garrison size, the weapon effectiveness, the training quality, and most critically, the will to resist. We expected token resistance. We encountered a force that had to be overcome with fleet-level assets. The lesson from Wake is clear. We cannot assume that isolated American positions will surrender easily. Each must be treated as a serious military obstacle requiring appropriate force and planning." But the real lesson from Wake went deeper than military tactics. The issue was not just that a small force had defended well. Many small forces throughout history had defended well. The issue was what this defense revealed about the broader conflict. If Wake, 2.5 square miles of coral, required 2 fleet carriers and 12 days to capture, what would the Philippines require? What would the Solomons require? What would the advance toward Australia cost? The mathematics of the Pacific War were revealing themselves. Japan had achieved stunning tactical victories in the war's first weeks. But the strategic arithmetic was implacable. Japan's empire now stretched from Burma to Wake, from the Kuriles to the Dutch East Indies. This vast perimeter required defending. Every island, every base, every position had to be garrisoned, supplied, reinforced. Wake demonstrated that even small American forces, properly prepared and determined to resist, could exact disproportionate costs. Naval analyst Captain Yamada Yoshio, reviewing the Wake operation in early 1942, calculated the force-to-space ratio that Japanese defenses would require. If Wake, 2.5 square miles, required a garrison of 1,500 troops to hold against American counterattack, the Japanese immediately began reinforcing. Then defending the thousands of miles of perimeter would require forces Japan did not possess. He wrote in a classified analysis, "Wake demonstrates the fundamental problem of our strategy. We can conquer the perimeter. We have proven this. But can we hold it? Every position must be strong enough to resist American assault. But America's industrial capacity exceeds ours by factors of 5 or 10 to 1. Eventually, they will generate the forces to assault every position we hold. We must then defend everywhere, while they can concentrate forces for attacks anywhere. The mathematics become impossible." This analysis never reached the decision-makers. It remained in files, one of many pessimistic assessments that were filed but not acted upon. The war continued for 3 more years. Major Devereaux and most of the Wake garrison survived captivity, though conditions were brutal. 98 civilians were kept on Wake as forced laborers. In October 1943, fearing an American assault, the Japanese garrison executed all 98 civilians. They were machine-gunned and buried in a mass grave. This atrocity would eventually result in the execution of the responsible Japanese commander after the war. Devereaux returned to America in 1945. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his defense of Wake. He later wrote a memoir titled "The Story of Wake Island," in which he reflected on the battle's meaning. "We did not win at Wake. We lost. But we demonstrated something important. We proved that Americans would fight, that we could be trained to fight effectively, that we would not surrender easily. Wake cost Japan more than it cost us, and that ratio would define the entire Pacific War. We lost every battle in the first 6 months, but we made them pay for every yard, and eventually, the payment became too high." The transformation from certain victory to costly struggle happened not in Tokyo's planning rooms, but in the waters off Wake, in the sky above the atoll, in the coral trenches where Marines fought. Each participant underwent a parallel transformation in understanding. For Commander Tachibana, the transformation began when Hayat exploded. He had planned operations based on assumptions of American weakness. The sinking forced a recalculation. If American coastal guns were this effective, if American fighters could sink destroyers, if American Marines could repel assault forces, then every assumption required revision. He spent the rest of the war, until his death in 1944, trying to get Japanese intelligence to properly assess American capabilities. His reports grew increasingly pessimistic, increasingly accurate, and increasingly ignored. For Captain Abe of Soryu, the transformation came when he realized that his fleet carrier, which had struck Pearl Harbor, was now being used to overcome resistance on a 2-mile atoll. The inefficiency was staggering. Fleet carriers were strategic weapons, meant to decide battles between great powers. Using them for ground support at Wake was like using a battleship to bombard a village. It worked, but it revealed a deeper problem. If this much force was required for Wake, what did that say about the rest of the advance? For Major Devereaux, the transformation was complete on December 23rd, when he gave the order to surrender. He had believed, as all officers believed, that determined defense could delay, but not stop a superior force. Wake proved that defense could stop a force, at least temporarily. But it also proved that eventual defeat was certain without reinforcement or relief. The issue was not whether Wake could defend itself. The issue was whether America could generate and deliver the forces necessary to defend or retake its Pacific positions. In December 1941, the answer was no. By August 1945, the answer would be overwhelming. Yes, the psychological journey mirrored the mathematical one. Denial. This can't be happening. We planned for this. Doubt. Maybe our assumptions were wrong. Acceptance. We underestimated them completely. Recognition. This changes everything about the strategic picture. Transformation. We need to rethink the entire war plan. But that transformation came too late, or not at all, depending on which Japanese officer one examines. Some, like Tachibana, saw immediately that Wake's resistance indicated deeper problems with Japanese strategy. Others maintained faith that tactical improvements would overcome American resistance. The institutional Japanese military never fully processed Wake's lessons, never fully recalculated the mathematics of a war against an opponent who would pay any price to win. The broader context made Wake's resistance possible, but also irrelevant. Japan's conquests in December 1941 were strategically sound. Seize resources in the Dutch East Indies, neutralize American power in the Philippines, push the defensive perimeter far enough that American bombers could not reach the home islands or crucial resource zones. Wake fit into this as a necessary chess move, removing a potential forward base for American operations. But the mathematics of production doomed this strategy from the beginning. In 1941, America produced roughly 5 times more steel than Japan, twice as much coal, 60 times more oil. These ratios meant that for every ship Japan built, America could build 5 or 10. For every aircraft Japan produced, America could produce 10 or 20. The only way Japan's strategy could succeed was if America accepted defeat after the initial losses and negotiated a settlement. But Wake demonstrated that America would not accept defeat, would not negotiate, would fight for every position, no matter how remote or how hopeless. The ratio of casualties, 1 to 7 in America's favor, was unsustainable for Japan. If every Pacific battle resulted in such ratios, Japan would run out of trained soldiers, sailors, and pilots long before America's industrial might translate it into deployed forces. And that is exactly what happened. By mid-1944, Japanese units throughout the Pacific were under strength, undertrained, undersupplied. American units were growing stronger, better equipped, supported by logistics that seemed infinite compared to Japan's threadbare supply lines. Wake Island remained in Japanese hands until September 4th, 1945, when Japan formally surrendered. The garrison, cut off and isolated, had endured 3.5 years without meaningful resupply when American forces arrived to accept surrender. They found emaciated Japanese soldiers, fortifications prepared for an invasion that never came, and the mass grave of the 98 executed civilians. Today, Wake Island is a minor American territory, home to a few hundred personnel supporting military and civilian operations. Tourists sometimes visit, though access is restricted. At the airfield, now much expanded from its 1941 configuration, stands a memorial to the defenders. The names of all American military and civilian personnel killed are inscribed on plaques. Japanese tourists occasionally visit, paying respects at the locations where Hayate and Kisaragi went down. A common question tourists ask the memorial guides: why did it matter? Wake fell anyway. The Japanese held it until the end of the war. What did the defense achieve? The guide's standard answer captures the deeper truth. Wake mattered because it demonstrated that even when facing impossible odds, even when reinforcement was impossible, even when defeat was certain, Americans would fight. Japan expected quick surrender from isolated positions. Wake proved that assumption false. The 12 days Wake held cost Japan forces it needed elsewhere, delayed operations, and most importantly, revealed that the Pacific War would not be won easily or cheaply. Every island Japan conquered after Wake, they knew they'd have to fight for. That knowledge didn't change Japan's ultimate defeat, but it changed the timeline, the cost, and the strategic calculations on both sides. The real significance of Wake becomes clear only when comparing initial Japanese expectations with final outcomes. The operation planned for 6 hours took 12 days. The expected token resistance required fleet carriers to overcome. The assumed quick victory became a Pyrrhic success that cost more than the island was worth. The defenders, who were supposed to surrender after a brief bombardment, fought to the last round of ammunition and beyond. The discovery that Commander Tachibana made on December 11th, watching Hayate explode, was the same discovery that eventually every Japanese planner would make. The mathematics that looked so favorable in Tokyo planning rooms did not account for the human factor, for training, for determination, for the willingness to pay any price. Wake's garrison was mathematically doomed, but they made that doom so expensive that the larger strategic picture shifted. Japan could win every battle and still lose the war, because the cost of winning each battle would exceed the resources available to continue fighting. The final irony was that both sides were right. Japan was right that Wake could be taken with sufficient force. America was right that Wake could be defended long enough to matter. The island changed hands, but the exchange rate demonstrated that Japan's strategy was unsustainable. One atoll required 2 fleet carriers. The Pacific contained thousands of atolls and islands. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. Japan could not generate enough force to hold what it had conquered. What seemed like a tactical defeat for America, the loss of Wake Island, was actually a strategic revelation. The Japanese military was powerful, but not unstoppable. Well-trained, but not invincible. Determined, but not fanatical enough to accept the casualty ratios that continued resistance would require. Every position, like Wake, defended with the same skill and determination, would cost Japan more than Japan could afford to pay. The mathematics were staggering, and in the end, they told the only truth that mattered. War is arithmetic written in blood, and the side that understands the numbers first does not always win, but at least knows what price victory requires. At Wake Island, both sides learned that lesson. Only one side could afford to pay the price the lesson revealed.